Welcome to Built to Win, the podcast created to help you level up your business game by developing a success mindset made for the long run. In this episode, Neora co-founder and president Amber Olson Rourke and executive VP of business development Dave Fleming talk about making tough decisions. They'll break down the importance of learning to make hard decisions, explain why making a wrong decision is often better than making no decision at all, and they'll offer some of their favorite strategies for making a hard decision.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Built to Win. I'm your host, Dave Fleming, and with me is the co-founder and president of Neora, Amber Olson Rourke. Today, we've got a great topic lined up for you, and it's something that you're going to face no matter how big your business is. You know, if you're a Fortune 100 or if you're a mom and pop startup out of your home, you are going to have to make some hard decisions along the way. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So really excited to dive into this topic and understand why leaders have to be the person to make that decision. And, you know, Amber, and you've been in business for a long time, as have I. And one thing that we've noticed is that people, they want to avoid making hard decisions. And we want to talk a little bit about that. Why is that? Why do people have a hard time making decisions? And one of the things that I read recently from the Harvard Business Review of all places is that it really comes down to something that's very easy. It's just stress. People don't want the stress. They don't want the pressure of making a hard decision and being wrong. You know, that's one of the things that you have to figure out. And as a leader of an organization or as just a leader of what you're doing in life, that's something that you have to start to get comfortable with, is you're not always going to be right. But that's one of the things about making hard decisions that is a reality. Amber, from your point of view, you know, you've been in business for a long time. And one of the things that we frequently talk about in business is, you know, is comfort zone versus growth mindset. And from your perspective, I'd love for you to just talk about making hard decisions and how that really comes from a place of growth versus comfort.
I think this is such an important topic because I think that it's something that most people are capable of doing, but they're scared to do. So to me, that's an opportunity, right? One of the things that I always learned growing up, I guess it must have been my dad that always used to would say it, is that the size of the problem that you can solve is directly related to the size of your paycheck. Meaning if you can't solve big problems, you know, you can't get to where because that's your value in the marketplace at the end of the day, right? As a human, our mind and our decision-making capabilities, especially when we look into the future of AI and what roles those will take. One thing is that humans can make these more nuanced, emotional, complex decisions that are in alignment for what's best for their company. And so that is, one of your superpowers as a human and as you in particular, because every single person has a different background, different life circumstances that have helped them kind of shape their worldview. And so making those hard decisions is absolutely 100% a part of your job as you get to more and more responsibility. So if you want responsibility, you want a big paycheck, you want all these things, you can't avoid making hard decisions. Like that doesn't align. There's no role that I can think of, whether it's in business or sports or anywhere, where those people that have the most amount of responsibility also have, the biggest portion of hard decisions that land on their desk. And, I have had countless truly sleepless nights where I could not sleep at all because I was laying in bed ruminating on some of these hard decisions that have kind of come into my wheelhouse over the years. So it's not to say that it isn't hard, but your ability to go ahead and make that decision and your ability to lead through that decision is what can set you apart. And, why I think having core values as a company is really, really important, because you'll hear me probably in every episode refer back to one of our core values, because that's how, we make these hard decisions. And so you have to have that compass. If you don't have that compass, it becomes even harder. But one of our core values at Neora is to embrace and drive change. And so while that sounds like very just, embrace and drive change, what it really means is you can't sit in your comfort zone. because in your comfort zone, in things status quo, in things as they were, you're never going to exponentially grow. You're just kind of exist as you are at that moment in time. And so a growth mindset means that you're coming to the table with a point of view that while things how they are today are more comfortable, there might be areas where how we are today, how our business is operating today, is limiting our growth, or we're missing growth opportunities. And so, to capitalize on those growth opportunities, we're willing to make hard decisions, but those hard decisions have to be in alignment with the value set that you started with. So that's what's always kind of brought me to peace and allowed me to end up going, eventually going to sleep and getting back to sleep filled nights. Is I always found that making those hard decisions that are then in alignment with those value sets allows you to sleep at night, but it doesn't allow you to escape making some very hard decisions.
That's a really good point too, because it's own at the end of the day, you still have to own the decision for better or worse, but being willing to make that decision. I remember not too many years into my career, I was working for a company. This was a big company, and I was working for a vice president of a major market there. And I remember just being absolutely floored one day because he told me, he's like, when we run into a hard decision or hard situation sometimes, I find that if we just let it play out, that it will usually take care of itself. And I remember just having kind of a physical reaction to that, thinking, but that's not why you're in that role. Like, your role isn't to like just let
Let
things
things
play
play out
out
as they will.
and see. Right. It was like, what, I couldn't even really fathom like that kind of thinking. That's why I love the value that you brought up is embracing change. And as a leader, you can't let things happen and still claim leadership, at
Right.
least in my mind, right? Like, if you're
Because
claiming
where are you
leadership,
leading people to? It's like you're
right?
leading
Like,
them where they would have already gone.
right. It's like, okay, so I'm just going to let things play out. And of course, like, there's an asterisk on that. Sometimes that is the right decision, but generally, we're talking about generally as a leader, you have to make a decision. Otherwise, like you said, Amber, like, where are you taking people if you're just letting things play out? And so that was really formative in my early career. Like I said, it wasn't too many years into my career, but it was pivotal because I was like, that's not, to me, that's not leadership. That's the opposite of leadership. That's kind of like letting someone else step in and be the leader. And if you're going to let somebody else step in and be the leader, you can't claim that you are being that leader. You can't claim that you're leading anything because you're letting it happen. So that was really interesting. But I love, and again, I want to emphasize that point, that like embracing change, like embracing and driving change, because change, if you think about change, fundamentally, you cannot grow without change. So if you are going to make a decision and you are going to drive change, that fundamentally means growth, in a sense. Like, you are either growing through change or you are changing by not growing. And so I think that's one of the things that we want to remember, especially as leaders, especially as people who are guiding, managing organizations, that your decision to make a decision or your decision not to make a decision is in itself a decision. But
Yes, no decision. I think that's something that so many people don't quite see, is that not making a decision is a decision, but instead of you being in control, it's kind of like a default decision. And so rarely is that going to, get you where you want to go. In my mind, one of the best examples of this unwillingness to change and not make a decision is Blockbuster. They had the right to win in terms of the movie space, like, but what was comfortable to them was you coming in and renting a hard good, a DVD, and checking out, bringing it back in. And they could have more quickly, if they were willing, have shifted to where the market was going and become the Netflix, but they didn't. So to me, that's always like a classic example. That's on a large scale, but the same thing happens every day to all kinds of businesses and all kinds of, entrepreneurial things that we see. It's just you don't realize the impact that not making that decision is having.
I love that you brought up that example. I was in an airport one time. I think it was in New York City, flying back home, standing in line waiting to board the flight, and I happened to be on a flight standing next to some of the attorneys that were representing Blockbuster as the Netflix and the
No
Blockbuster thing
way.
was going down. And it was fascinating just to be a fly on the wall and listen to the conversation, because they were like, oh, this thing, speaking of Netflix, they're like, this thing isn't going to last a year. This thing is like a passing fad. And they were so sure that this was not going to be a thing. Like, they did not have to worry about this. And I don't know who these guys were. I don't know like where they were in the pecking order of things, but obviously that was the decision that Blockbuster made, was
Yeah.
to not change. And we know how that story played out. And there are a lot of examples just like that one, but that has to be one of the top five in terms of biggest or biggest lack of decision making, or lack of recognizing that growth was absolutely necessary if they were going to continue. And but it's funny that you brought that up, because that was such a like a light bulb memory for me.
I think for a- and I think for a lot of people too, they as you're making your way up, because it's easy to understand like this CEO of a company, makes decisions, but there's a lot of things that work up to that. And when I see it, when people are even in, maybe in charge of their department, or in charge of an important project, or in charge of their own store, or in charge of their own business that they just like started, this fear of not just, we talked a little bit about the stress, but it's like the fear of, if it's wrong, if it's a wrong decision, people will blame me. And I think that whole kind of internalization can paralyze people. And, the irony is that like when you're an entrepreneur or you're a leader, you're assuming responsibility. So, if things go right, you get, the responsibility of it going right. If
Right.
things go wrong, you get that responsibility. But responsibility doesn't mean that you're going to get fired if it was the wrong decision, the world's going to end, your business is going to go out of business. Like, it's just responsibility that you learn from that, and you can help pivot to where to go next. Like, no one in the world ever makes the right decision all the time. And the more you go up, you'll make decisions that literally probably cost the company hundreds of $1,000s. It was a wrong decision, right? But you have to have that willingness to accept a certain level of risk to be able to get bigger reward. So it doesn't necessarily always mean getting it right. Like, that's impossible, but it means that you at least are able to gather the right information, make the best decision possible, and move, because movement is better than nothing, right? Movement towards something is better than nothing. And so I think people can, no matter where you are in your career, you can start to build that muscle. We talk about that a lot, because any entrepreneurial skill set, business skill set, you have to build it just like a muscle. Start, making decisions on things that make you just a little bit uncomfortable, and build from there. But like, you've got to start somewhere, and not just kind of defer all decision making upwards or to someone else.
For sure. And you think about that, because you're absolutely right. I remember I worked for one of the companies that I worked for, working for the president of the company, and he told me one time, and I wouldn't say flippant, but certainly confident would be how I described him, because he said, I only need to be right 70% of the time, because the average person's right 50% of the time. So if I'm 70, then I'm way above average. And I remember thinking, well, that's certainly one way to look at it, but that was how he took the pressure off of himself. Like you said, like,
Right. Yes. I
he's
think that's so
verbalizing
key.
like, okay, I'm not perfect. I'm not going to make the right decision every single time. But also, if you think back, going back to the Blockbuster example, because you have to think about how many times did they double down on their position? How many times did they reinforce the decision that they made? And like you said, most companies, and even Blockbuster, at some point, they could have changed their course. They could have made a different decision. But by the time they made that different decision, and I guess I don't know enough about the inner workings. Maybe at some point they did, but if they did, it was too late. And so you're right. Like, most of the time, a decision you make, yeah, maybe it's the wrong decision, but it's very rarely fatal. It's very rarely something that does in the business. It's very rarely something that really puts you in a position where you can't come back from. So I think
That's
that's
such a
important
good
for people.
point. Yeah, because I think you're right. There's probably hundreds of points where they could have pivoted from that initial decision. That's one of the most important points of kind of being open and having vulnerability is that they double down. It's kind of like that opportunity cost, like opportunity decision. We've already decided to go this way. And then there were probably warning signs, and then there were flashing red lights, and then really intense red lights that they kind of just decide, well, we've already decided to go this way. And a lot of times when you make a decision, it's the wrong decision, you get that feedback fairly quickly. You can kind of tell this was probably the wrong direction, the wrong decision. And as a leader, being willing to accept that feedback and being willing to say, oh, it looks like, this wasn't maybe the right decision, owning it and moving forward. Like, people respect that out of a leader. Like, that's what they're looking for. I've had to do that countless times. Like, hey, we got it wrong here, but we're not going to just keep getting it wrong, to like double down, like you said, on this direction. So let's, regroup and let's pivot to, what we need to be doing. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that is good leadership, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think good leadership is absolutely willing to say, I got it wrong. I think when you look at leaders who are not willing to admit that they've ever made a mistake, I think then people pick up on that. People are like, well, obviously you're not going to make it the correct decision every single time. Like, that's just an unrealistic expectation. So I think it does show stronger leadership when people can own up to it. Say, hey, I blew it. I did not make the right call on that one, and we're gonna course correct, and that's okay. That's part of, like you said, that's part of being a good leader. I want to talk a little bit about, like, as you're making hard decisions, especially as a leader of an organization, or even as a small business owner, wherever you happen to find yourself. But some of the things that help as you kind of evaluate how to make a hard decision. And for me, it's kind of the same questions that we frequently ask. It's the why, who, what, when, where, basic questions as you noodle things around in your head about what it is. But I think one of the things as you're coming to terms with a really difficult decision, a hard decision to make, is why you're making that decision in the first place. Like, were there things that led to you being in a position where you have to make a hard decision? And if you could go back, would you change things? And if the answer is yes, I think that's an easy way for people to say, okay, we can make a hard decision, but based on the knowledge that we now have, we can make a better decision. And I think that's but and smarter people than me have said it before, but if you start with why, a lot of times that will help frame the conversation, frame the decision in a way that's much more productive than just being stressful and imposing fear as you're thinking, oh, I have to get this right.
And insightful too. I don't know how many times I've seen people get to a decision point and they don't really take the time. They're kind of operating out of fear. They don't take the time to really understand like you said, why am I at this particular juncture? And they make a decision, and then they end up at the same, maybe a different circumstance. They're right back in that same circumstance like a year later, because wherever you go, there you are, like still you. And they are totally unclear of why they keep ending up in the same place. It might look a little different, but in the why of why they end up in these, hard situations, sticky situations, a lot of times they don't get clear. And sometimes it's not, it's not that case. It's not your fault. You're in that point. But the point is really to understand the why behind whatever the decision is, and why you're at this decision point, so that you can be informed and you can make it from the right perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that perspective, especially, I want to emphasize that part, because perspective matters a lot. And one of the following along the same idea is, like, if you know why, and then understanding, like, who are the players in this decision, and who is benefiting from the decision that you're making. When I study psychology, my undergraduate degree is in psychology, and one of the really helpful things that came out of that, for for better or worse, I can't turn it off. But when you're making a hard decision, or when you're in negotiations, or when you're just talking through things, understanding what is motivating the things that people are saying in that conversation, and what is motivating people's opinion on what we should or shouldn't do. That's also really helpful when it comes to making a hard decision, is really trying to understand the motivations behind the concerned parties. And of course, that comes with a big fat asterisk, is that you can't make assumptions as to
Yeah.
what people's motivations are. That gets you in more trouble frequently than
You can come up with
understanding.
some good stories in your own head around that.
Right? Yeah, it's like, oh, this person wants to do this, and you've got this whole backstory made up, and then you come to find out, no, that has nothing to do with the motivation. Sometimes it's really simple. Sometimes the motivations are clear as day, and so it's hard not to jump to conclusions sometimes. But I've always found that, digging below the surface and really doing some due diligence on why people are pushing for the position that they're in. Is it for best for their team? Is it best for themselves? Is there a major contract that's in play that we have to do this in order to do that? Those kind of things. But understanding the motivations is really, really important. And then also deciding, like, are those motivations aligned with my desired outcome? Because if they are, then that's great. But if they are not, that means there's more discussion that we need to have in order to come to an agreement and make it a win-win, an old business term that's been around for a long time. But I also do believe that there are win-win outcomes in almost every scenario too.
Yeah. And I think another point, another way that helps clarify for me in hard decisions is just pen to paper. And like you said, just a general pros and cons list that seems like, very elementary, but it's really not. When I like am faced with something and then I can, because if we just make the decision solely in our mind, like we just talked about, you come up with so many stories that probably aren't even true, and you get on these like hamster wheels. So like, here are the pros of making this decision, here are the cons of making this decision. And then if I went the other direction, what are the pros and cons? And then you can look at the list and get really clear, like, what of these on the pros is the most important to like my long-term goals, and what of these that are on the cons are like, I'm just not willing to to have that impact, or I'm not willing to have that consequence, or I'm not willing to go that direction because it's not in alignment. And so if you're not clear about where you're trying to go, what you're trying to achieve, and if you're not clear on the things, and I think we've talked about this in another podcast, you want to be clear on the things you're not going to do in business, just as clear on that as a list of things that you want to be, so that you can use those in these scenarios. And then when you write those pros and cons, and put it pen to paper, it starts to kind of become clearer of like where the pros are the strongest that are in alignment to where you want to go, and clear which of those decisions has cons that are more towards that list of things that you aren't, that you don't want to be, or you don't want to have happen in your business.
Yeah, yeah, I love a good pro and con list. And I also love the idea of ranking the priority of one of those things on your pros and cons list. Because I think a lot of people have been in a situation where your pros and cons list is kind of a 50-50. It's almost a toss up.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, that wasn't super helpful. But what I found is helpful is that then you start prioritizing what's on there. And there are some times I can think of specific decisions that I've made where, there might only be one or two things on the pro list, but there's a whole bunch of stuff on the cons list. But those one or two things that are on the pro side outweigh all of the things on the con side. And
Yes. Yeah.
that's where you have to, as a leader, you have to recognize that and say, okay, yeah, there might be a lot of negatives, potential cons associated with this decision, but I know we have to do it because these, and maybe they're minimal, but these things matter, and we have to make this decision because of those things. And I think that is a super helpful exercise. And I think that's something I'm a huge fan of. I think, as you're thinking through it, one of my favorite things to do is play out the decision.
Right.
Look at the short-term effects. Are we putting a pause on growth, for example, in order to grow bigger long term? Or, is growing short term, is that what we really need? And we're affecting our long term outlook by making a decision that's gonna, and those are decisions that I think people face consistently in business. Is, does this deal give us better profitability, better cash flow, but it might hamper our future potential? Those things are, I think, very common, but those are things like you said, a pros and cons list can really help tease that out and make sure that you're making the decisions that's best for you, best for your organization, and also stay true to who you are as a leader. When we talk about making decision also, I think one of the really important things is understanding who benefits and are the right people benefiting from a hard decision. I one time years ago with a company that I was with, we had a tough decision. We had to recall some product. We didn't have to recall some product, but we chose to recall some product because there was, a couple of our products found something in there, wasn't supposed to be in there, didn't have to be recalled. So we had this dilemma, right? We had to decide, well, it's not the end of the world if we sell a product with these things in there. Like there's nothing regulatory, there's nothing that's like illegal, there's nothing like absolutely 100% okay to keep this going. However, what is the impact to our customers? What is the impact to our salespeople? What is the impact to our brand if we continue to sell a product where we knowingly knew that there was something in there that shouldn't have been in there? And so we
Right.
decided to voluntarily recall this product. And man, it was a hard decision. It was a very, very difficult decision because our salespeople were like, "Oh my gosh, our companies, our customers are never going to trust us. What are you doing to my commission? Like it was like you said, when you talk about sleepless nights, there were some
Yeah.
sleepless nights. Like, did we do the right thing? But over time, what we realized is that because of that decision, that our customers actually trusted us more than
Right.
less, and our salespeople actually benefited more long term because their customers were more loyal. They saw the kind of brand they were working with. They saw the kind of leadership that we exhibited, and it was, long term, it was a more beneficial outcome than if we had just let it ride. But that short term was no fun. That was no fun at all. But it was the right
Yeah.
thing to do.
Yeah, that's why I think if you can think about it in terms of 5 years out, what is going to play out most beneficially for you, and if it's a personal decision, because it's always we get so stuck in like that moment. And I've seen this a lot too. People make terrible decisions because they're so stuck in the moment and not understanding at all the repercussions long term of the decisions that they're making. It's like you have to have that long-term lens that you can apply to a decision that's happening in the now. But like you said, what is that going to do long term for is it going to move you closer to your end goal or further away from it? Because a lot of times there's sacrifices that you have to make in the short term to get you closer to where you want to go in the long term. And there's sometimes where you're taking shortcuts or trying to, hit the easy button in the short term that's actually going to take you like way off course for where you want to be if that 5 year lens is applied.
Oh, yeah, I know. The easy button sometimes makes me cringe because the easy button is
I
not
see it so much. It's crazy. I feel like
right.
I think post COVID, I'm not really sure what happened, but it's like people now just want the easy button in all areas of life. And it's like that doesn't exist. Nothing worth having has an easy button. So it's a mindset more than anything.
I totally agree with that. I think it's, and I hopefully things evolve, we get away from that. But I think you're right. Like I think people are looking for the the path of least resistance. And in my experience, and I think yours is, and most of our listeners probably would agree with this, but the path of least resistance very rarely leads to the kind of success and the kind of results that you want. It's when you think of the path of least resistance, it's basically it's the fastest way down. And so, you
Yes,
know,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah, because anybody can do it. And that's why it's one of those slight edge principles that I love is that, successful people do what unsuccessful people are not willing to do. And it's one of those time tested philosophies because in an era of easy button seekers, are you somebody who chooses the right decision and the right path, regardless if that might look harder? And I think those that are able to do that are more now than in any era that I've been in business are able to separate themselves. Like it's an actual separator, you having that ability to do that, which, is kind of good news in a way, because that used to be kind of common stakes, not so much anymore, but now it makes you stand out if you're able to have that discipline.
yeah, it's so funny how so many things come back to those core principles. And if you have those core principles set up from the beginning, that makes these hard decisions a little bit easier. Not to make them some things are never going to be easy. That's just the reality of business or the reality of life. But those core principles will back you up and get that foundation in place that will make some of this stuff a little bit easier. But let's do this. Let's give our listeners some advice, some actionable things in terms of how to make hard decisions with integrity and staying true to who you are as an individual, as an organization. For me, one of the first things is just transparency, like understanding
Yes.
why we have to make this decision. And honestly, like sharing that with the people who it's going to affect. Because so many times people are afraid of making a hard decision because of the people that it's going to affect. But in my experience, so many of the people that it does affect are so much more understanding if you explain the why behind the decision. If you don't explain the why, it's like we talked about earlier. You know, people are going to come up with the story. They're going to come up with the
Mm-hmm.
backstory and all the reasons why you did what you did. And very rarely is it going to be correct unless you share it with people.
I agree. I think that is one of the most important parts in delivering a hard decision as a leader is to have that level of transparency, which creates trust. And I think getting to the answer of a hard decision, I would say my best tip is to really to be discerning in what's most important, and to then take give yourself a certain amount of time to really kind of sit with that, trust your gut. I think, and a lot of times your gut already knows the right decision, like you feel it, but then you let fear talk you out of that gut kind of feeling on that decision point. And then once you make that decision, because it's a hard decision, usually it means not everyone is going to agree, and that's okay. I talk a lot about with our leaders and our sales team is that your goal um, as a leader is not necessarily to be liked. Your goal as a leader is to help lead people. Leading and being liked sometimes are at odds with each other. Not everyone is going to like that decision in the moment. But if you're doing what you are there to do, which is to lead, that has to be the most important thing to you. Leading people has to be more important to you than being liked by people. And that's something that a lot of people really struggle with. And here's the thing, I made a lot of hard decisions throughout my career, and decisions that maybe even a lot of the people I was leading didn't like, but they all still liked me as a human. Like no one is like, it's not blown anything up. It's just that you're not creating decisions by committee, because very rarely does a good decision get made by an entire committee of people. Yes, you want feedback. Yes, you want to take in that information, but you as a leader then process all that information, you sit with it, you look at it, and then you make that decision, and then you lead with clarity and commitment. Because anytime you're not really clear. I always say clear is kind. People are looking for you to be clear. And so if you're kind of wishy-washy and you're not really committed, that transfers to other people. Now they're uneasy with that hard decision you're made. They're not willing to lead you or follow you through that. So, there's so many examples of such great leaders, that led people with their conviction, like starting at the beginning of US history and George Washington and him leading his, they were outnumbered, all at odds stacked against him, but he was leading with like, this is our path, this is the right decision, and we can win. And so people followed him. So that level of belief and commitment and steadfastness as a leader goes a really long way to lead through a hard decision, because that's what people are looking for you to do as a leader.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that, if you as a leader, if your goal is agreement, you're going to have a very different outcome than if your goal is growth or getting to a place achieving your goal. Because like you said, very rarely do organizations have 100% agreement in where we should go, what we should do. That means, in my experience, my opinion is if you have 100% agreement, you're not asking the tough questions. And
Oh,
so
I love that. Yeah, totally.
one of the other things that I love to do, and this was a principle that I was going to say I give credit in business school, but I think it goes all the way back to when I was a kid playing Risk. But The ability to make a hard decision is really studying out the effects that your decision will have and long term. And recently, popularly, that's called game theory, but it's not a hard thing to do. It's kind of one of those things that sounds more complicated than it really is, but it's just understanding what happens if I make this decision, then what? And if that happens, then what? And the more steps you can play that out for yourself, for your organization, then the better perspective you'll have on the decision that you want to make. And so I think that's, as I approach difficult decisions, hard decisions with any organization, that's what I try to do is play it out as far as I can see. And the farther that I get, it just kind of automatically helps me become more comfortable with the decision that I make, because sometimes it becomes very clear that what seems like a good decision very quickly becomes a very, very bad decision. But and you said earlier, like if you're so caught up in the moment and just in the heat of this particular fire that we have to put out, you can't always see that perspective. And so I think it's important to just step back and game things out and look at what happens if I do A, then B, then C, then D, and just see take that as far as you possibly can, because that's going to lead you to a more comfortable place with the decision you have to make. The next one for me, and I think this is so, so important, because I think as a leader, people are looking to you to be committed to the decision.
Yeah,
And
100%.
frequently, yeah, leaders sometimes are like, oh, maybe you're like on the fence, like 50-50, this was a good decision. But I think your organization, your team, they can read that in you. And if you're not committed to the decision that you made, if you're lukewarm to the decision that you made, it doesn't matter if you made the right decision or not. Even the best decision prepared and delivered in a lukewarm way, I think is going to be a bad decision. I just think like leadership means that once we're committed, we are committed and we're all in on this direction. That doesn't mean we can't course correct. That doesn't mean that we can't fix it, right? Like you said earlier, we're not going to get it 100% out of the time, get the right decision. But if once we're committed, we've got to go. We've got to act. We know that this is the decision that we've made, for better or worse. We're going to do it. Yeah, if it turns out that was a horrible decision, we are going to course correct. That's okay. Like, it's okay to course correct because we make mistakes, but you got to own it. You got to fix it, but you've got to come out of the gate. In my opinion, you've got to come out committed to the decision that you made. Otherwise, any decision becomes a bad decision.
Yeah, if you don't get people in action, right? Because action is always better than inaction. And if you don't convey that level of commitment and conviction, it's going to just breed people not taking action, not getting behind it. And then, like you said, it could be the best decision in the world. You'll never know because no one's taking action on it. And so it's like you've got to lead in that direction, get people moving that direction, and know that, like you said, you can course correct. I think, but leading from the front and not talking, like you said, with asterisks, like, well, this is the decision, but, and it's kind of like they can already tell you're half in, half out. As a leader, you have to be able to communicate clearly and with conviction so that people will not just follow you in the easy things and the things that they want to do, but also follow you through hard decisions, even if they don't necessarily agree with those decisions. That's when you're a great leader that's earned the trust and respect of the team you're leading.
No, that's a great point too, because as a leader, and if you've proven yourself and you've earned the right to lead people through some tough times, it's that capital that you've built with your team that allows them to trust you and let you not only make good decisions but also make mistakes, but for them to back you up and to follow you as well. I think that's also a really good point. Is any decision that you make, even the most difficult decision, does become easier if you've built up that capital with your team that allows them to see you not only as a person, but as a leader who's just doing the very best you can. Some of the best advice I ever got was that you have to make the best decision that you can with the information you have at that moment. And if that information changes, then maybe your decision will change as well. You have to give yourself that leeway to be able to say, well, at that time, that was the best decision. Now we might make a different decision. Of course, it's super easy to look back in history and make decisions differently, but that's all you can do, is make the very best decision you can make with the information you have in that moment. And like you said, go all in and commit to it. Cause I cannot think of a worse feeling than making a great decision, but never knowing how great it would be because you didn't fully commit to it and you never found out if it was the right decision or not. Like,
Right.
talk about sleepless nights. That would be
Yeah.
a tough one. Well, this was a great chat. Hopefully everybody listening got some great things. I think that if you listen to this episode, I think there's definitely some things in here as a leader that you can take away from this and make hard decisions more confidently, hopefully make better decisions. And, but at the end of the day, as a leader, make the decisions that are going to drive your organization, your own personal life, and help get you to the places that you want to go. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Built to Win.
That was Amber Olson Rourke and Dave Fleming talking about making tough decisions as a leader. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you learned something from it, please share it with a friend or colleague who you think would also benefit. And if you're new to Built to Win, we invite you to go back and listen to our story from the beginning. You can find us wherever you download your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please rate us and leave a review to let us know what you think of the show.